Welcome back to Ribbon Candy Hooking. I'm Deanna, and we have a special treat today. I am here with my sister, Jessica David, and she is working at Yale right now at the Center for British Arts. We talk to each other so often about our respective interests and work, and there is a lot of crossover for us because Jessica spends a lot of time in the Tudor period of painting, restoring that sort of era of painting. We talk a lot about color and dye, where it comes from, chemical pigments versus natural pigments. I'm always talking about dye on this show. We are many of us at-home dyers, both with natural dyes and also with all the chemical dyes that are available now. Now, we talk, Jessica and I, about, when we're looking at painting versus textile, what are the differences? Where are the crossovers? What sort of themes are running parallel? Which meet up, which never cross, these kinds of things. And today we're going to look at a slideshow that she's put together that is gorgeous slideshow full of information, looking very close up at a series of Tudor paintings that have an emphasis on textile. So you'll see more as we go along. Should we get started with the slideshow?
Absolutely. And I just want to say I'm delighted to be addressing this group. I've heard such wonderful things about you, and I've been a participant on many a bingo night and other coffee time, incognito probably. But I'm so grateful to be here chatting with you. And I'm going to share my screen now. I've encouraged Deanna to, I'm just trying to share my screen. I'm so sorry. It's being a little silly.
Computer, it's bound to give some play.
It is. It's being quite adorable right now. And not, hold on. Excellent. We're going to do that again. Here it is. Three times the charm, guys. Excellent. So we're doing a novelty for us, and I think for Anna too, that we're talking together on Zoom, recording a PowerPoint presentation. So, and then sometimes showing videos. It's going to be awfully exciting how we get through this.
Welcome to 2021 moment.
Exactly. Thank goodness, we're so Zoom adept now. Again, I'm so pleased to be meeting you. And like Deanna said, I work a lot on the Tudor and early Jacobean period of English painting, which is very rich in portraiture and amazing textiles with the most incredible effects. And those are really what I'm speaking to today. But I thought I'd start us off kind of on a sort of level playing field in the world of pigments. And many of these words, these names, madder, cochineal, buckthorn yellow, you will recognize from the world of dye materials. Not every painting pigment lends itself to being a dye material, which we'll see, and certainly not every dye material lends itself to being a painting material. But there's a good host of them that are crossover, like we said. And what's so interesting is how historic painters in history used dye materials to represent textiles that were dyed with the same material, if that makes sense to you. So there's a crossover in the actual object and how it was made, a textile, how it was embroidered, and then how the painter chose to produce it, or reproduce it, I should say.
And this is so interesting because, some of the textiles, some of the pigments that I'm looking at right now, I'm familiar with because I own them as natural dyes. Others I've heard the words sometime in my past life, but I have not seen them available as possible dyes for dyeing fabric. And I guess these will be the ones that we talk about later that fall into this strange, category of pigments that you can paint with, but you cannot dye with. This is a category I was not even aware of. So we'll see more of that as we go along.
Absolutely, yeah, we'll see, and shortly. So I'm just going to highlight a few of these colorants. So we're going to take azurite, cochineal, and verdigris. We're just going to talk a little bit about them because I think it's so interesting how these get transmuted to be different kinds of materials, paint materials, dye materials. So azurite, many of you will know, and you can probably tell from the photo beneath it, is mined. It's a chunk of stone, and it has an incredibly reflective, beautiful blue surface. It's covered in this sparkly effect called druzy, and it's a remarkable pigment because it is basically ground up. It's not actually one of the trickier ones to make. You grind it up and then you levigate it, and levigation is a way of separating pigment and water.
So would azurite be mined for the purpose of pigment?
It would, you know, it is still occasionally used as like a gem in jewelry, but because it is, how to put this, like it's a bit crumbly, it's a bit funny.
Yeah. Doesn't have a
It's
lot of
tricky to work with.
integrity.
You can't polish it, or
Oh,
you can't polish it easily depending on, and because it has a range of grades in it, like it has the sparkly stuff, the really expensive high grade bright blue, and then it has like a silty grayish color that we're about to see. So
okay.
the reason it gets levigated is because historically artists, painters wanted to um, get the most out of the color. So in that chunk, you know, there's like some of this grayish white stuff, and then there's some really beautiful blue stuff. So what you do is you grind it in a muller, and then you put it in water, and you'll see right away that the silty gray stuff sits at the top, and the amazing blue stuff is at the bottom. So
Whoa.
how you separate that is by filling the jar with water, pouring off the lightweight silty stuff until you're left with like grades of different blues. So, and this is basically one chunk of azurite gradated from basically a light, you know, a super inexpensive grayish blue to a super expensive sparkly blue. Um,
Oh,
I know it's kind of amazing. And then they would be priced and sold accordingly. So, and
oh
we'll
my
see
gosh.
examples of this stuff in a painting. Possibly too far down the rabbit hole here, but like these are very tiny particles. They're really tiny. They also don't have a great color. So this pigment does not lend itself to a dye. It's like dyeing with sand, colored sand. It's
Exactly.
gritty.
So this is
Um,
well, sometimes we talk in rug cooking with dyeing. We've talked many times in coffee time about the kinds of pigments that will sink to the bottom and never blend and become part of the water.
right.
Because if something blends and becomes part of the water, it becomes a dye. If it doesn't, it sits at the bottom and it will never become a dye. It sounds like this qualifies as one of those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Whatever would sit in your water is not worth having because it's like a grayish brown, nothing color. And this heavy stuff sinks right to the bottom. Um, Quite. And so verdigris, you probably heard of. It's a very ancient pigment. It's been made since ancient times. I mean, Greek painting earlier. It's basically made by simply putting a sheet of copper into vinegar or an acid,
Like
acetic
liquid
acid.
silver. Okay.
Exactly, sorry. And then this green stuff grows on it. It's basically a corrosion product of the copper. And this is an easier one. You just scrape it off and then you grind it in water to clean it. And then you grind it in your medium of
Wow.
choice. And so even though it's a little, there's a, you know, a dormancy stage waiting for it to grow, it actually is quite straightforward. As all the dyers here probably know, dealing with dye pigments, especially ones that come, example from, sorry, backtracking. So here's our copper in the jars with the green growing. If you're extracting a colorant from cochineal, if anyone's bought cochineal because they want to play with it because it's awesome, you crush one of those little tiny dead bodies, insect bodies, I shouldn't say beetle, and it immediately makes your fingers red.
Oh,
Making that a fix onto a textile or make it into a pigment for painting is a much longer process, as anyone who deals with the raw material knows. To use this as a pigment for painting is incredibly laborious, and that is reflected in its price through history and today. It is still an incredibly expensive pigment to buy and has basically been entirely replaced in the modern world by alizarin crimson, which is a ubiquitous, really strong tinting red purple color, but it's still not quite the magic of cochineal. So cochineal is turned into a pigment by basically using the dye to dye a colorless pigment. So you take something like chalk and you dye it with this, and through a long process.
so this is
So
like a
basically the
vehicle.
dye,
Is it
yes,
like
rides a vehicle. Sorry, Alan, go ahead.
is it like a vehicle, the cochineal?
So the cochineal is the dye, and it rides a vehicle of another kind of colorless,
I see,
inert.
it needs a medium.
Exactly. And then that gets ground into gum arabic or a drying oil like linseed oil or poppy seed oil to become paint. But this whole
Okay.
process of extracting the colorant, cleaning it, and then putting it onto an inert vehicle requires a lot of time and a lot of chemical process.
Interesting.
Um, yes,
And
exactly.
ironic for everybody who, like you say, has touched one of these little insects. It must be a bit of a wind up because it's like, wait a minute, it immediately stains. What's so
Absolutely.
difficult about getting color out of this?
Exactly. It
And
stains, but how to make that stay in paint and behave like paint.
yeah.
And we'll actually, and the thing is, in a way, these dye pigments, which in the paint world we tend to call lake pigments, like red lake or yellow lake.
Lake is like lac, like shellac, right? From the beetle.
You know, I bet it's etymology. I'm not like, I think it's related to that, absolutely. And yet, like, the word lake can be any color of these like dye pigments, so it can be yellow too.
Oh,
But I'm sure, I mean, I think it's so close, there has got to be an original
there
crossover of
must
etymology. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I want to add before we move on that verdigris for those people who like history, and I know there's a lot of people on this channel who love history. And Jessica, we were talking about this last night at your place. We were talking about like what the Washington D.C. area as far as like planning a trip, and Mount Vernon, which was George Washington's place, right outside, right over the border. And at Mount Vernon, when you walk into the first room on the tour, which was the first room that anybody walked in, it was right through the front door. He had verdigris paint on the wall, and everybody always used to say on the tours, what a loud color, was it typical? I just pictured it, everybody having these weird sterile hospital whites all over. And they were so surprised that there was such a strong color. But the reason the tour guide at Mount Vernon said that he chose verdigris was because it was expensive and it was a status symbol. So I always thought that was interesting, and it stuck
That
with
is
me
really
because
interesting.
it really is that crazy seafoamy green. It's bright.
It is bright, and that's interesting. I mean, I think of it as not the upper end of artist pigments, but then again, I'm thinking of it as something that's covering this wide and not, walls and walls. So I'm sure it adds up.
Yeah.
Excellent. So sorry, we're just running through these. And then, of course, all these pigments. Sorry, I just wanted to end with the classic turning the pigment into paint. So dyers aren't concerned about turning their pigment into something that is a paint stuff. But if you want to apply these materials with a brush, you of course have to put them into a medium. And the medium is really, for if it's watercolor, like I said, it's probably gum arabic, or it's a drying oil, or whatever if you're working with another medium. So you will grind these on a slab with a muller, and then you make your palette that way once you've prepared the pigments.
This thing that looks like a glass top.
They are glass mullers, yes.
Interesting. And the top one is watercolor that's doing that light yellow color. That's like watercolor based.
There is, I think, to be honest, I think all of these are being ground in water because that's part of the process of cleaning them. Almost every pigment has to be ground in water first, sometimes several times to remove impurities, and then you put in your paint medium. And that's kind of when you hit the timer, especially for oil paint, because obviously drying oil dries permanently. So once you put it in the oil, you're going to be using it soon.
Is it safe to assume that like in the Tudor period that painters were generally doing this whole process?
That's a really good point that I forgot. No, they wouldn't be. They'd go to the store, send their assistant to the store to get so many grams of, of cochineal. So, absolutely.
I mean, it's a long time ago. I was thinking, did they send like the pet dragon to the store, or did they like grind everything at this vast table?
Absolutely.
So there was for sale.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So pigments were typically sold during this period at apothecary stores with all kinds of things that you would use for medicinal purposes. So people who knew about all kinds of ingredients, natural materials, medicines, poisons, all kinds of things, it was kind of categorized with those. And indeed, I mean, you make a good point. And then the pigments would probably be housed in jars, and then really, depending on their cost, really carefully disseminated to an apprentice who would do the grinding and pigment preparation. So when we're talking about the kind of paintings we're about to see, it's definitely, like an assistant who's preparing this material and basically presenting it to the painters for use.
Well, this is interesting because it has a lot of crossover with what we were talking about this past cocktail night last Friday. We were looking at a book from 1927, and it was by Ella Bowles. And she was saying in the book, in her chapter on dyeing, she was saying, if you cannot get a hold of this particular pigment, go to your local pharmacy. So as late as at least the 1920s, people who were going to do dyeing at home or looking for pigment bases at home were still going to the drugstore. That's just a weird thought, because the apothecary, of course, is a drugstore.
It is
just a weird thought.
It is a weird thought. And you think, I mean, what replaces it? I mean, the art store, maybe intermediate, a general store that happens to sell some artist materials. But also keeping in mind that a lot of obviously pigments used for dyeing and certainly for painting are incredibly toxic. And so one would have to kind of receive, I mean, you'd have to know what you were going for and know how to handle it.
So interesting, isn't it? That's a whole other episode, thinking about the evolution of the apothecary, in terms of
Absolutely.
like our use. There, I guess there isn't a lot of need anymore. There are some rug hookers who dye, there are some painters who use pigments, but of course there's more people who would like, plastic flowers and beach balls than would like cochineal.
I'm
So
sure.
yeah.
Absolutely. We all love dead insects, especially ones that die strong, but it's limited. They're tiny too. Like you'd have to buy like thousands to do some decorative project with them. Um, Excellent. So, I'm not going to dwell on these slides. Here we're seeing, again, an early a Jacobean portrait, actually, by the amazing painter Cornelius Johnson, who spent most of his career in Britain and then finished his career in the Netherlands. But I'm just showing on the next couple of slides the kind of ways that we get to the bottom of how these paintings are made. So of course you can look at the painting and you know what was available in the world in terms of artist materials. So you can make a really good guess as to what was used to make them. But we want to go a little further. We really want to know what artist or what studio used pigment and mediums in what way. So we do X-radiography, the same way a human gets X-rayed, a painting you get X-rayed. We use infrared photography. X-rays go right through the paint layer. Infrared is great at showing you what's right beneath the paint layer. So it's wonderful at showing underdrawing and that kind of thing. And I'll show you that in the next slide. Obviously, we use microscopy at different levels. And here we're actually seeing azurite, which we were just seeing in the previous slide. And this is actually a paint cross section. So this is one of the few destructive methods we use. The paint sample is much smaller than a pinhead, and under very high magnification. You can see the stratigraphy basically from the ground layer. So, the white chalk, that ubiquitous white first layer, up through a drawing layer, and then this honking thick layer of azurite from one of the decorative leaves and flowers on Temple's doublet.
It's just crazy with the azurite, like what you were saying, that it can't be a dye because it doesn't grind fine enough. You can see that in both of the last two photos. It's super
Absolutely.
sandy and gritty.
Super
And
gritty.
if that's as fine as they can get it for a painting, that's as fine as they can get it, right?
Quite. And
Yeah.
absolutely. And this is actually high grade azurite, which means it's it's bigger particles, but of course, remember, the finer it is, the less color it is. So you wouldn't want to use it fine because then you've lost your reason for using it at all. Basically, it doesn't have the same color anymore. So this is beautiful blue, and it is like, as you can see, it's like spreading sand over the paint layer. And this is obviously in an oil medium. Everything we're seeing is in an oil medium on panel or canvas, and I'll mention if it's otherwise, just if it's relevant to our conversation. So this is another painting from almost the exact same time by a different painter, and using the same techniques. And I just wanted to show here that this is in the infrared photo. We're looking through the paint, not all the way through the canvas, just through the paint layer. And you can see these very loose charcoal-y sketch lines drawing the Countess of Kelly's hand. So each of these techniques is sort of complementary. We're looking at different levels of the paint layer and kind of through the back of the paint. And again, a cross section, one of my favorites, through I think a highlight of the lace that's overlapped onto the chair, and it's just every single paint layer, like a lasagna, in one cross section. And I think, again, you can see how some of these paint layers are made up of things that you can actually see individual particles in, and others are not. So this green layer here, which looks like an amorphous emerald green, is actually a verdigris-based material. It's verdigris kind of mixed, it's kind of heat mixed into a resin, and it creates something like that's just a totally kind of super fine glaze. It's an amazing spreader of a colorant, and we'll come back to that.
I think you have to address the bird climbing up the dress.
Right, the bird climbing up. So we were teaching a class a few years ago, and we had a really long conversation about whether or not that's a dead parakeet, until I realized that we were getting our legs pulled, and it was like the Monty Python joke, like, is that bird dead? So the bird is not dead. Very slow on figuring that one out. I think it's a live parakeet who is clawing up her impossibly expensive embroidered skirt to get to a tiny almond that she's, or like some kind of nut that she's holding. I'm sorry, it's hard to see, but you can probably see right there, there's like a little nut, and he's making his way. She's super nonplussed by this event, which is great.
Yeah, she doesn't look overly happy, but I guess that was just the sort of austere or stoic look that people had style-wise in this period.
Absolutely, yes.
And it's so remarkable how much information you get and you need, because I'm assuming you need this much information because when you restore a painting, do you need to use the exact same thing?
That's a good question. That comes up a lot. And no, we deliberately use different things.
Okay.
It's good to know it's there because these are very old paintings, as you can see, and they've been restored a lot in the past. So there's original paint, and then there's hundreds of years worth of other restorers putting things on top of it. So that's really important for us to know, deciding what level to bring the painting back to, and also to know if you're really worried about this paint passage, is it actually even non-original? It's something that someone did in the early 20th century. And that actually brings me to conveniently the next slide. This is a portrait by the wonderful William Larkin, again, a Jacobean painter, of a woman named Jane Thorney, interesting pronunciation of her name, an aristocratic lady. And I'm going to show you a technique that's a totally non-destructive technique, which is X-ray fluorescence scanning. And what this does is it takes an impossibly slow scan of the paint layer and shows you the elements that are in the paint layer. So this technique doesn't say that's an iron pigment, that's ochre, but we can infer from the elements it finds, and based on looking and other ways of analysis that you just saw, what the paint layer is, or indeed what the mixture is. And this is another great way of understanding what's original and what's restoration, because obviously pigments change over centuries. So if you have a lot of 20th century pigment on top of this painting, you know that's not original, and that can help guide you in your conservation treatment. So this here, we're not going to dwell on this. This is just another example of the kind of newer technology that helps us understand palette.
So if you know that what's showing up is iron, then that eliminates or rather narrows the choices of pigment that it is.
Absolutely. So based on that and some other elements that are exactly, related to the locations of these, we can figure out that it's yellow ochre mixed with brown umber. And that's what that paint layer is. Absolutely.
Interesting. And, it's such a good point, when you think about it, because I just assumed, even though we've talked about painting hundreds of times, usually with cocktails, but it's like, I didn't really get the idea that if you were to mix, for example, alizarin, and you were to paint it, if you knew that blue scarf was alizarin, it wouldn't match, because there has been hundreds of years of not only restoration, but aging. And I'm assuming there's some kind of a glaze on there. It wouldn't match, right?
Absolutely. It wouldn't match.
That's crazy. Yeah.
So that's a perfect reason. You can't just use the original material and assume you'll get a perfect fit, because it won't be a perfect fit, because your paint hadn't aged for 400 years. So basically you're always compensating for time. And then as soon as you finish that restoration treatment, it's like, hit the clock, we're starting a new gauge, because my restoration is now going to start aging at a different rate. And over a number of years, suddenly it won't match anymore. So that's why it's like, we try to make our treatments last. And I'll come to this a bit at the end. We try to make our treatments last, now ideally upward of 50 years, 100 years. This is our great dream, our great hope, right? To kind of slow the process of having to redo and traumatize the painting. But
Dorian
it's all decaying.
Dorian Gray, every painting, yeah.
Absolutely. There's no stopping time completely, right? So this is another scan just showing a different element. Finding mercury can be really wonderful, because mercury really only relates to one pigment, and that's vermilion, which is a really ubiquitous fire engine red, orangey red pigment. Again, from ancient times, it's man-made, it's incredibly toxic. Obviously, it's mercury-based, but it's used extensively in flesh tones and to make these bright red, note in comparison to these cool purpley lake dye pigments. And really, it's the only red that can make that. And I also just wanted to show this example, because really for the first time, you get a sense of how the paint is manipulated. So you see down here that there's sort of an extra bright halo of this pigment around her fingers. Well, I mean, you can't see that with your eyes. It's just the artist happened to go over that area to kind of sharpen the fingers. And you get a sense of the gradation that's happening on her flesh. So it's not a solid layer as it is on a flower. It's creating a blended layer to give three-dimensionality.
Wow.
And we're going to see more of this. But it's a wonderful technique, and it's really the first time we can see this kind of manipulation of pigment, kind of in individual kind of element form. So we're gonna back out again and start using kind of our eyes instead of technology to look at these paintings, because I wanted to talk a little bit and look at examples of how Tudor and Stuart painters manipulated paint to look like textiles. And this is a great period for textile observation. Obviously, they were incredibly expensive materials. I mean, as I mentioned before, textiles tended to be much more expensive than, say, a painting or many other forms of decorative arts, with kind of tapestries being at the very upper echelon of that price range. So a lot of people are presented, and perhaps certainly clothes, I think for the most part they would have owned, but like really just with the most nuance as possible to get across to the viewer that, this material is velvet, and then it's embroidered with like real gold threads, and then there's real pearls, and then there's real silver. So the idea that the painter had to kind of find a way to create that like trompe l'oeil effect, I think was very prevalent, and it really, it had a lot to do with certain artists being very popular at certain moments. So we're going to take a walk.
It sounds like the 16th century equivalent of like somebody with a microphone at like the Academy Awards or the Emmys or whatever, asking whose dress you're wearing.
Quite, absolutely. Who painted your dress? Absolutely. And I love, these two examples, different painters, two amazing painters, both foreign-born immigrant painters in Britain, which was incredibly common. Immigrant painters had the gold seal in Britain at this moment. One very kind of jubilant young sitter. Then we have Francis Walsingham. So anyone who watches the Tudors knows he's bad news, spy master, scary guy. Very somber portrait. But the painters who rendered them used very similar techniques to give an impression of a variety of textiles and effects, which granted, when they're in the galleries now and you see them in natural light and dim light, it's sometimes hard to see this and appreciate how much effort went in to creating an optical illusion. So this is
get that close, right? You're not allowed to get that close.
You can, for a moment you can, no.
until they reach you.
It's true. This is done with slight magnification of a camera lens, but this is a wonderful effect that I can't not mention because it's using a textile to emulate a textile. So basically, on the left we have a lake pigment, a dye pigment. We haven't analyzed it because there's really not that much of it there either. It could be madder, it could be cochineal, it could be Brazil wood. Probably all these words are familiar to dyers, and it's in oil paint. It is an especially slow drying pigment, and we'll come back to that. And while it's still wet, you can do fun things like imprint it with a textile to then push that optical illusion of textile. And on the right, we have the same thing. In this case, it is a verdigris derivative green, like we tend to call it a copper resonate. It's like a verdigris copper green mixed in a resin that again has a wonderfully viscous texture. So the blotting has like a twofold function too. At once, it imparts this textile texture, which is great because you're painting a textile. And it also helps remove, right? Because you're blotting it too. And these are the slowest dryers. They're just inherently slow. And so the faster, the more you can remove and the faster you can get it to dry, you can move on with your life, right? Because you can add your pearls, you can add your pearl highlights. So it kind of helps. There's a very economical and logical way of approaching this as well.
It's totally remarkable that, particularly the one on the left, that blotting gave, that looks like fabric.
Yeah.
That looks, the pearls, it's too close that you can tell the pearls are painted.
Yes.
But if I just saw a crop of just the red, I would say that's fabric, no question.
Absolutely.
Bet the jackpot on it, That's
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
It's remarkable. And I'm going to show a couple of examples that are other ways of manipulating. I feel like that the imprinting, the blotting is like a real trompe l'oeil, that expression didn't exist at this time, but it has that effect. It's like giving a false impression of a texture. But there are other ways of of manipulating paint and brushwork to give false impressions. And I use these two examples because it just underlines the fact that I was thinking, when we talk about these different mediums, that, rug making is an additive process, right? You have to add material, yarn, or, wool to make your composition. Paint is, of course, you're putting paint onto something, but it can be additive or subtractive. And so a painter can move back and forward in the paint layer. And so, for example, on the top, we have Marcus Gerards again, amazing, and another Cornelius Johnson. And Gerards, or indeed Gerards Studio, is doing this method where he's, again, putting a thick layer of, in this case, lead white, and while it's still wet, scraping it away to give this impression of the cutout pattern of a kind of sort of lace cutout fan end, which is remarkable because it's actually such a small moment in the painting overall to like do this sort of, experimental kind of playful technique. It's really remarkable.
That's
and
remarkable.
The sleeve of Martha Temple, it's amazing. We were talking about this, like, it's just so rare that in this moment of painting where everything is illusionism and soft gradations and like dots, that you see a moment that's really painterly, because it's not a really painterly moment, right? But this one stroke, it's a highlight on her really kind of stiff, kind of tight silk bodice that is a flat end brush that's just pulled straight across. And then not blended. So it's actually a rare moment that we can see the exact shape and size of Cornelius Johnson's paintbrush. And then of course, that is on top of this base color, and it doesn't smear this, right? So this was dry when that layer went down. And then of course, this was dry, this paintbrush, when the pearls went down, when the highlights went down, and then lastly, when the red lake, when the red dye pigment shadow went down. So think about all of these layers, and each of them has to be dry before the next goes on, or we would see it smearing. And each layer takes 3 to 5. Red lakes take a week, maybe, to dry. You can start actually backing out of a painting and figuring out how long it took to paint the entire thing, which is great fun. It's one of the classic, assignments for students is to kind of back out and estimate how long it could take.
Really?
Absolutely. And it's wonderful on paintings where you see evidence like this because it's just clearer. You can actually see the process. And
I think that's so cool. When you told me about this last night, I just thought that was so cool, being completely in a different field. And if you can imagine, as of the viewers, if you can imagine how neat it would be if you were an art restorer and you rarely get information, like immediate information, like this brush stroke. I mean, it feels immediate. It's like he did it, he pulled the brush off the panel, he walked away, and that's his immediate work that you can look at, measure. There's so much information, I'm sure, in that one brush stroke for you.
Absolutely. And immediate's a great word. Yeah.
Oh, it's so cool.
Immediate painting is not something that pops to mind immediately in Tudor portraiture, but it does happen. It just happens on maybe a smaller scale than it happens in more contemporary paintings.
That's right. When you see newer paintings of different styles that have like high impasto kind of like lots of heavy brushwork, it's like, wow, it's almost like looking at a palette rather than a painting. But in Tudor work, it's very, very flat, isn't it? It's very clean.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. You're right. It tends to be all conceptual depth, not painterly depth, if that makes sense.
Tricks. I wonder what was going on. I do not know the answer. I wonder what was going on in history at that time. That sort of tricks of the eye, trompe l'oeil, like illusions, were so popular.
Absolutely.
It's a wrinkle in time. It's interesting.
It is amazing. And I mean, certainly the minutia of detail and texture gives away to, if you think about like Van Dyck and, to a more painterly, looser kind of overall atmospheric approach. But yes, this is definitely, I mean, it's a moment that lasts like 100 years, but it's definitely a moment where this nuance of detail, and of course not every painter did necessarily this, but obviously some of the most important, we're seeing some of the most important names in the Tudor world of painters.
Would you say, as far as like just aside, this is aside, unrelated, but would you say that looking at Tudor art, because of this, that unlike like later periods or even earlier periods of art where the painting style was different, would you say that looking at Tudor art with this heavy emphasis on the technical part of it, that if the painting isn't signed, it would be hard to find information to attribute it?
That is a very good point. painters rarely signed their portraits in their paintings in this period at all. And it's kind of a sick, misleading fluke that I've been showing you paintings that just happen to be signed by artists. It is an incredible challenge. It was not common for artists to take credit for their work, I think, because even if they had a wonderful reputation and they were successful, they were craftspeople. And obviously their status was much lower than any of the people they created for. Certainly certain artists had a much higher profile, and certain artists like Cornelius Johnson, like Gerhardt's, did sign and initial their work. There's also a feeling based on our research, and I do a lot of research with a scholar named Ed Town, I should name him, that a lot of more artists than we realize may have signed the back of the work. But because of restoration and age and thinning panels and adding material to lining the backs of canvases, we just don't have it anymore. So it could be misleading. Maybe more artists did claim, but sorry, I don't mean to labor this point, but it is an incredible challenge. And a lot of the attributions are based on technical and stylistic, compartmentalizing. And are they painting the right person? Is that the patronage circle? Is that a relative of the other person we know that person painted? So it's a lot of archival work. And
yeah, and this carries over into rug making too, because of course the early rugs typically are not signed. I mean, you rarely get a very early rug that's signed. Why would it's that idea of doing the craft, and you don't fancy yourself an artist, if you're doing it for your job, or in the case of rug making, you're just doing it to keep the house warm. You're just doing it for scraps and you're keeping the house warm. This idea now in the rug world too is like, you've got to sign everything, and of course you should sign everything, because historically it will give people a lot of information in 200 or 300 years. But we have not, until very recently in the rug world, had any sort of notion of signing your work. It didn't exist, and that's why you can't attribute so many rugs. Likewise, same kind of thing. But I think there is that big thing in people's heads of being a craftsperson versus being an artist. And when you're an artiste, different things go with being an artiste. Yeah,
that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And so sorry, we have some other details, and this is not showing us anything new. I just wanted to highlight another painting where there's this idea of layer and layer of texture and detail kind of being built up, because we're going to kind of return to this topic over and over again. And I also just wanted to show another moment where a definitive brushstroke, and I think you can see many of them here, are doing something deliberate. Here it's not a fold like it was in the portrait we had seen previously by Johnson. These are, I'm sure, threads right there. You can see the brushstroke because it's meant to be a stitch of embroidery.
Yeah.
And that was important to this painter, and probably to the sitter, to convey that this is an embroidered top, right? And this is an embroidered piece of velvet, and this is lace. So it was so important to give these clues to the viewer of the material. And also kind of it speaks to, I think, the artist's understanding, of course, because they live in this world too, of how, especially, for example, metallic thread catches and shimmers in the light and then kind of disappears into the shadow. It's such a complicated play that for the painter into their studio needs to be broken down into steps. And we're going to talk more about that too, that, this has to be painted before this, under thing gets painted, before the lace goes on. And then if you just observe the way that this sheer high level of trickery here, high level of expertise, this sheer layer of lead white paint, which is inherently a very opaque, thick paint, which we're about to see, is blended so impossibly thin that it still shows the pattern underneath instead of obliterates it. This is a lot of timing, of brush manipulation, and experience to do something like this. How many layers of opulence are being shown off in this one person's bust-length portrait is kind of impressive.
It's unbelievable. And this will strike people who watch regularly, because on Monday's episode of Coffee Time, we were looking at a book by Stella Hay Rex, and she has a chapter talking about how some of the early rug hooking patterns, people didn't have any ideas for patterns, and they looked at textiles. And one of the designs that I showed that day was of something called the Ipswich petticoat, because on the petticoat there was this beautiful, very Jacobean stylized floral, and somebody took that line drawing straight from the petticoat and hooked it as a rug, as a design. And you can see, looking at fabric, even much earlier back, but you can see why people would be intrigued and inclined to use textiles, especially fancy textiles. Lace designs is a classic thing that rug hookers have historically used for making borders and making designs. There's so much there, especially for people who love textiles, that is intriguing. And there's so much information there that you can borrow or steal, right? Like, I mean, you can just do the whole
Absolutely.
design. Yeah, that is so
Absolutely.
neat. There's so much to it. I mean, there's so much information in this one photo.
Absolutely. I love that idea. And we're gonna come back to more some other textiles that have amazing levels of intricacy and imagery. I move this around sometimes so we don't block everything. I'm stopping for a moment here, just a moment, to underline something that we've already talked about, which is that these paintings are made in studios. So the idea of the great painter, which everyone still loves, you know, Rembrandt, Rubens, you know, whoever, Van Dyck. I mean, from this period and that period, these are machines, these workshops, and they create multiple versions of the same portrait. So a lot of our great fun is trying to order the sequence in which they were made, or like the level of significance or intricacy in which they were made, what might be a source painting that the others are based on, and how this, you know, how this check out. And I'm not pointing this out to undermine the quality of any one of these individual paintings. They're all, as far as we can be considered, important to this artist's studio. But these are, all the paintings we're seeing are products of studio. So what I mean by that, simply put, is many hands are working on these paintings. It's not one person. And indeed, a painter like Van Dyck, Gerards, I mean, what would they be doing working on an entire painting? They would be wasting their time. They're simultaneously training new people who want to be the next generation of painters. And they're also spending their time, you know, I think liaising with customers, working on the important parts of the painting, like the expression, the face, overseeing, you know, quality managing things as they're going out of the studios, all kinds of things. So I just wanted to stop there for a moment, just to remind us that, again, these are busy workshops. So the idea of signing or not signing is also kind of interesting in that context, you know, when you know a dozen people may have helped this thing come into the world.
Yeah, and I guess in the Robert Dudley, like, I'm guessing that some people were better at painting different parts of the painting.
Absolutely.
It becomes like a Lucille Ball, like eating chocolates on a conveyor belt thing. If you can pass the painting onto the next person who's maybe better at the face, and you're good
Absolutely.
at whatever, the jewelry or whatever.
For sure. And,
But
you
I
know,
mean,
these,
go ahead.
no, and also, like, as we saw, like the multiple layers, you know, you could give something early on in the process to a younger, less experienced person to just block in flat color, right? Because no one's gonna make a huge mistake doing that. By the time you're doing final details on an embroidered something, you know, this needs to be someone higher up. And indeed, by the time you're doing final details on a face, this needs to be someone higher up, or, you know, someone much more experienced as
Oh, I
well.
see. So like all the underpainting and that stuff is almost like the stenciling or the blocking that could be done
Sure.
by just a
Absolutely.
person.
Transferring the drawings.
It does beg the question, like, how many paintings of Robert Dudley, I mean, do there need to be? I mean, was it anybody
So many
other
more
than,
than this.
yeah, Queen Elizabeth, because he's like one of Queen Elizabeth's beaux, right?
Yes,
So other
absolutely.
than
And
her, like, who else
political, yeah,
painted of him? Is it like stately homes, like would order a painting because they want to seem like
absolutely.
a friend or something?
Yeah, it's a very, I mean, it's a very like pedestrian, you know, comparison, but like, you know, when you order a photo of your kid from their school, you don't get one or two or three, you get dozens, right? Because for all the people. But then if you added a political element to that, suddenly, indeed, people who have nothing to do with this person personally might show a portrait of them because there is a political affiliation that they want to be. And of course, they want beautiful portraits on their wall. They want to underline their affiliation to the royal, you know, household or the court. So all kinds of reasons. And I'm sure a lot of these were proliferated for people who potentially knew Robert Dudley too, and were indeed came out of his residences into public collections. Some of them are still in, you know, former residences of his as well.
Oh,
I
I
mean,
see.
they're obviously owned by
He
different
does look
parties.
different from one to the next. He looks like, it's like marked differences. Even his hair color looks quite different from one to the next.
It's very complex. I know sometimes, I mean, there are some that I didn't include because I wonder if they are by the same person, but there is definitely like a telephone situation where you're losing something for sure.
Well, in the second one, his nose is quite good. Like, it's like he's been
Absolutely.
like kicked by a horse in the first and the third, but in the second one, it's like he's had a nose job somewhere in the middle.
Absolutely.
It's
And
funny. It must,
different.
yeah. But But it's such a cool notion that there were, number one, multiple people working on each painting, and number two, that this is a studio. This isn't, like you're saying, the romantic image of this
Right.
like traveling artist,
No.
box, sitting, having some woman sit for him in her parlor. This is like a
Absolutely.
machine. It's like a factory that just keeps chugging.
Absolutely. And I won't dwell because we have some more slides, but like also we talk a lot about, the evidence of artist sitter contact. And we know that certainly there are texts, there are treatises that describe, a painter's involvement with the sitter. In this period, it seems it's probably most common that an artist would have taken, if they could capture the person from life at all. That was not always the case. With Queen Elizabeth, if not everyone who painted her certainly saw her with their own eyes. Some of them were just based on prints or other paintings. But if you did get to have a sitter like Jane Thorney, which certainly Larkin would have been able to, encounter a person like that, probably only did a sketch of her face and maybe took some documentation on the kind of things she wanted to be dressed in. Very unlikely those are not Jane's hands. This is not a great moment. Larkin is wonderful, but this is not a great moment for hands generally in painting. Again, exception. But these would be pattern hands. So these would be a pre-existing, and you see these exact same hands in other Larkin paintings. So really it's just the likeness of her face that would have been taken and then put into paint, which is another interesting idea.
This might not be a great moment for hands, but it appears to be a great moment for boobs.
It is a great moment for boobs.
I mean, this is insane. This is
Yes.
like criminal even in 2021, this is crazy.
So I'm not a costume expert, but I know because of our conversations around this and similar paintings with this incredibly scooping décolletage, that there are affiliations with something called like kind of mask portraits. There is an element of costume and exotic. So in that context, it seems to be really okay to show most of your bust, indeed perilously, dangerously low. And we certainly have examples of sitters being dressed like this, and then indeed other portraits of them being covered up significantly more. So I think there is an element of the exotic, which kind of also, speaks to, the beautiful and kind of whimsical pattern of her garments as well. So we're seeing some more details of these garments. And I know it's sometimes hard, I think, when we go from PowerPoint to video. This is a very kind of micro blotting situation. So it's a little hard to see, creating this difference. I mean, sorry, I should digress a little. William Larkin is a name known very well to us now. There's a group of people called Follower of William Larkin, For many, many years, he was known as the Curtain Master because his name wasn't known. It hadn't emerged from archives. The great irony, of course, is that he probably didn't paint his own curtains, but he knew how to. But no, I mean, certainly his studio produced these amazing textiles and often these incredibly crazy, intricate, crisp curtains. And I think we'll take lots of looks, but this, I hope you can see the juxtaposition. It's like, this is one garment that seems to be red velvet, again, with the blotting on the outside, and then like a blue silk on the inside. So it's like a lined fabric. And so she's kind of deliberately showing, or rather Larkin is deliberately showing these two moments of the same fabric. And then we have a detail further on, but these, I hope you notice, these are not the same pattern. The bodice is kind of pansies and roses, and then the skirt, we'll see more of, has amazing creatures and sea dragons on it. The bodice is sort of a diffused kind of light, and the skirt seems to be like a silky color. So they're actually probably different fabric. This is probably embroidered linen, and this is embroidered silk. And the nuance of that, I think it's kind of easily lost on a modern audience, but the nuance of that to a contemporary audience, I think it's very significant. And the virtuosity of a studio that can do that, obviously, is a huge selling point. And again, I'm just showing the different ways paint is manipulated to get three-dimensional lace. So it really looks like lace. It looks like the paint is woven like lace. As well as this is an incredibly close detail of one of these little like moments on her bodice, where these little bumps, I think these are embroidered stitches going in a circle. So each little raised like little tooth of paint is a stitch, and the yellow ones are meant to be gold and the gray ones are meant to be silver. So an incredibly,
that's unbelievable, luxe
moment. Yeah. And again, just a little moment reminding us that these are paintings, and this is a lake pigment, this is a dye pigment, slow dryer, goes on last, and then invariably we see it accidentally smearing, dragging, overlaying onto other things. This is, you don't necessarily need a cross section to figure out the sequence in which things were painted. And indeed, I love this, an accidental splotch of azurite, probably from here, or one of these details accidentally hits kind of right here in the skirt. And of course, probably no one saw it. Whoever did it was like, I'm not saying anything. And it just never got picked up, right? Just back away from the painting. So I think, oh yes, no, we're good. I also just wanted to underline the fact that, you know, we see lots of these like individual dots dragging brushwork. And they, as we know at this point, these are deliberate manipulations of the paint to push the paint to its boundaries to look like other things. So when a soft gradation is wanted, no problem. This is done with a blending brush to create impossibly smooth gradations with the paint wet and wet. So instead of building it sequentially using marks, you kind of place the paint wet and you add a highlight and then you blend it to create an impossibly smooth surface. This is her cheek. So there's an incredible array of manipulations and paint thicknesses going on to create this illusionism. And again, this is just another detail kind of driving it home. You know, if the painter wanted to make this a soft gradation, they could, but they deliberately left it a little furry and hairy because it's embroidery, right? They want you to know that that is not, you know, an imagined moment. This is embroidered, an embroidered flower. And again, they did dots of stiff paint to make the stitches going around these.
To drive the point home, again, the idea of not blending, this idea for rug hookers can really relate to that, particularly people who strive to do really realistic, perfectly blended hooking, which is always done with a fine cut. For people that aspire to that, you already know the difficulty, what Jessica's describing with paint, you blend it, you mix it, it becomes one. It becomes like the cheek, perfectly blended, like flawless. But if that's impossible with textiles, the best you can do is put one thing next to the other thing. And at one point, the other thing has to be a different color because you're going for shading. And that's a really tricky thing. That's why highlighting is hard, shading is hard, doing any kind of realism in rug hooking is hard because you never blend like you can with paint. You're always putting one color next to another color. And you have to get that order right for it to really look like it's truly blending. But this image showing a textile that would be like crewel type embroidery, you know, you would not, the white would be very distinct from the rose petal. So you would not have those blend, and to make this look like an authentic embroidery in the painting, you would have to paint it so that they weren't blending. So that's, it's like a weird reversal.
It is a weird reversal.
It could be blended, right? They could blend it.
Blend it, yeah.
Because people who deal with fabric can't blend it.
Right, but they're showing the limitation, I don't want to say the limitation, but the character of a textile. So then they have to emulate the limitation by like, yeah, it's a weird reversal idea. And so I have some slides that are meant to be fun. And I know this is a rug making group, but just to kind of maybe put into play, like what I'm talking about when I say certain paints lend themselves to different effects. You can always add things to paint. You go to the store now and there's like aisles and aisles of additives, dryers, you know, retarders for slower drying, stiffer paint, thinner paint. But historically, you didn't have all that at the apothecary. So you had to push by adding more or less oil. You could add dryers. So, you know, what's really interesting is lead white, and this is lead white, is a fast drying pigment. Lead dries fast. So a lot of artists would actually boil linseed oil, for example, in a lead vessel or with a lead component to create like a faster drying oil. But not every artist did. And so for example, this is cochineal, and I think you can already see these little piles have different textures. And you can see in this detail, the lead white paint is just naturally stiff. It's like a mayonnaise. It lends itself to that. And I'm going to transition really fast. We practiced this before, so let's see how fast Jessica can do it. Probably not fast at all. Okay, we're back. So I just am showing here a little example. This is the same lead white paint that we just saw sitting on the palette. And again, I am not employed in Larkin Studio, so forgive this action. But I just wanted to show how viscous and how like stringy lead white paint can be. And this is kind of an inherent quality. I'm now just showing how it's very standy-uppy. And it will dry like that. It will dry having that slightly imposter three-dimensional texture in a way that a lake pigment, sorry, not just a red lake, will not be able to achieve. Sorry, we're just gonna go back down. So now we have a little demonstration of what red lakes, for example, this is cochineal's virtue is, or really most lake pigments or dye pigments, and that is not to be manipulated to be three-dimensional. Their great virtue is their ability to be spread thinly to create a veil of color. And again, because they take so long to process, they tend to be very expensive. So guess what? You probably want to use it really thinly, which is wonderful. So if you apply this and then softly, softly blend it with a lot of patience, you can create just, again, this seamless veil, which is often used on cheeks, for example, like the cheek we saw with absolutely no brushwork.
And
And
it
I'm
looks
just,
more like a stain than a
it is
pigment.
more like a stain, absolutely. And so here we just see it over, this is like a gessoed board. But I'm just using this as an example because this is, again, a way I do teaching when we're teaching historical painting practices, and also just to get people's idea into the idea of layering an economy of paint. So we create this textile inspired by Jane Thorney, guess who? And I have the students build up from a ground color, basically a dead color. So this is exactly the kind of work perfectly suited for a very low level student, apprentice, flat color, vague sketch. And then putting on a couple of very inexpensive pigments. So lead white to create the highlight, a stripe, and then blend it, allowing this blue to show through, right? So you're using economy, you're not totally covering it. And then indigo, a classic, again, an ancient material that you know from dyeing as well, that has extremely strong tinting, very inexpensive.
That
And
last,
then,
sorry, that last picture is going to be very interesting to rug hookers because you can see the way that highlights break down so well in all of
right.
this.
Wonderful. And we have another, yeah, we have another, exactly. It is like the sequence. So again, this is like the wonderful leap of faith. We know because you just saw that this pigment can be blended impossibly thin, but you put a big honking layer down on it and you're about to obliterate all the work you just did and let dry. But once again, patience and blending, and specifically being really careful with the kind of brushes you use. I'm like a real gentle stickler when we do painting classes. I actually tape the paintbrushes down to the table and number them, and you can only release them because some brushes are only good for moving paint. So you'll only use a boar bristle brush to move the paint from your palette to your support, your canvas, your panel, whatever. And then if you want to move the paint around like broadly, if you want to blend, if you want to get a super smooth surface, you have to use a sable brush, and they have to be kept distinct from each other. Historically, both expensive, but sable more so obviously because of its the desirability of its coat. So this is where we, the end of our, it was kind of a drapery painting boot camp. But I show this overall slide because I hope you can see that depending on how the students, how carefully or how evenly they blended the red, they ended up getting, in this case, a cochineal, they ended up getting something that looked more like a velvet, or if they'd let this highlight show through, something that's more like a silk. So that's another way of manipulating paint. You don't necessarily have to blot. You can strengthen or weaken the highlight, basically, to create a more diffused or a sharper looking surface, if that makes sense. We're wrapping up here, but I just wanted to touch back down kind of into all of our worlds. Firstly, I mentioned that I do conservation of painting, which is my primary job, believe it or not. So I'm currently treating this painting, and it's had a hard life. I'm not going to go through all of it. It's by an artist called Paul Van Sommer, who painted the woman with the parakeet climbing up as well. And this was a wonderful moment in the treatment because I really, I didn't see this coming. I probably should have anticipated it. But as I removed the varnish from her sleeve, and you can see there's damage and such, but there was suddenly this moment of brilliant silver highlight coming off of her sleeve. And of course, if it was everywhere, it would be flat. But the point is, it's just right here on her shoulder. And it shows you that this is like a three-dimensional scalloped edge that lifts up, which is so gratifying and also just so incredibly clever. And we'll look at another example of this in just a sec, but the highlights don't always match up with the thread. There's something of a confusion. And we see this again and again, especially with Van Sommer. He is a little more painterly. Because, when you see a highlight in candlelight or reflection, it's not sharp, right? It's kind of like a sparkling, confusing effect. And I think that's what he's doing here. He's creating the opulence of just catching something that's beautiful and unexpected, as it was for me. So I'm bringing out, it's like we're doing like a 180, but we don't have too many textiles at the British Art Center, but we have some amazing ones. And I just wanted to show this because it's an embroidery. I know it's not a rug. And it was made by a woman named Mary Linwood, who made a number of embroideries after oil painting. So this is after a painting by George Stubbs. who painted many tigers and animals, as you probably know. And you can see that, it's a landscape with very little green and a bit of blue. So obviously we have a lot of fading. But I've been looking at this, and I took some photos when it first came in, about how, how Linwood translated an oil painting, but also the added difficulty of the pattern of the tiger. So you have the three-dimensionality of the animal in space, and then this like quite, abstract pattern on top of it. And it's very complex. And she did an absolutely amazing job, I think. And again, there's been a lot of fading, but gradating this orange, like, around his face, around these solid black stripes, which is completely amazing. You get
it's
a
so
sense.
interesting because you've shown us painters trying to capture the look of a textile, and here we've got a textile that's trying to capture the look of the painting.
Absolutely. It's a back and forth, soup. It's amazing. Speaking of backs, I just had to show these because Deanna and I were saying, like, it's a really messy back. Like, you can see how she went back and forth for the eyes,
Yeah.
but never intended to be seen. Amazing recto. Amazing.
Don't feel bad about your rugs. Forget about what the back of them looks like. Mary Linwood did this.
What a spider web. And it brought me back to, we're now seeing the Jane Thorney again details. About this, the artist grappling, and we've already covered this now, thank goodness, that grappling with the idea of three-dimensionality versus like, two-dimensionality, or like the tiny moments of embroidery, and how to like translate that by allowing your paint to be unresolved in places into kind of color block areas. So this is the caterpillar, something underneath this three-dimensional lace. And there's so many examples of this artist like figuring out how to make velvet next to satin over embroidery with sparkly bits. And again, I couldn't resist this example because I think it's another one of these moments where the highlights are just meant to be a sparkle. They're not meant to be understood literally. And it's also such a small detail. It's not like you would be able to, but I love these moments where there's abstraction on a minute level, and where illusionism sort of wins out over clarity in a way, or, painterly illusionism.
I love it.
I know, right? So we're seeing details of Jane Thorney's skirts, which I know we saw some of, but there's some really suspicious characters floating around her skirts. It's actually really amazing. And I think we're wrapping up there. And I know Gianna wanted to mention a couple of things. But thank you.
As I said, Jessica, that was fantastic. Please, viewers, leave comments and questions for Jessica that are specifically anything that she knows, which is everything about the painting or about these paintings, or questions or thoughts you have as a result. Put them into the comments of this video. And I am going to, as you know, Jessica, I'm going to spend some time making a composition to celebrate this great video. And I'm going to use the Thorney portrait and come up with a composition that incorporates all these crazy sea monsters and stuff. And I'm going to dye with my chemical dyes. I also have natural dyes. I'll have to see what works best. I'm going to try to replicate like a verdigris color, the cochineal color, and maybe one other color that we've talked about today, and incorporate them into a rug hooking pattern that involves this dress design. The whole composition of the painting is beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful portrait, but I think so odd and curious is the patterning on this dress with all of these little sea monsters poking their heads up. We are right on the threshold of summer. We might as well see, the bird is great too with his abstracted wing. Yeah. But I'll come up with a really good composition, and I will tell you how I came up with colors that match Jessica's pigments that she would use in painting. I'm going to translate those to wool, and when I figure out how the colors work, I will post the recipes for them. So for the 3 colors that I plan to do, you'll be able to see those recipes and recreate them yourself. So we will, Jessica, thank you again.
Thank you.
And we will see you for the next part of the video. Did you want to say something else?
Not at all. Just thank you very much, and happy rug making. And it was a pleasure. I'll see you soon.
Super fun. So, doing a video like that with my sister got me even more fired up and interested in dyes. I'm already dyeing every day, almost every day of my life. But this got me really interested in the natural dyes, and particularly the conversation that we were having about things like the azurite that will never be a dye suitable for wool. because it can never be ground down to that fineness. And once it is, it loses its integrity to the extent that it could not be used anyway. So all of these mysteries, sort of Russian nesting doll of interest and information, so much information, I think, came out of that Zoom thing that we recorded. And as you know, my intention after it was to go follow up. We're talking about the fine art pigments as opposed to the fiber pigments. What crosses, what's parallel, what's different. And so, of course, I had to follow up in my kitchen late at night, trying to figure out how to recreate some of those dyes. So when I was thinking about the garment, what was her name? I already forgot it. It's always right there. It'll come to me with the sea monsters, the unforgettable sea monster costume, right? Thorny, the Thorny portrait with a very long spelling. The primary colors in that were like a really rich teal that was a silk or a satin on the underside of the shawl she had draped over her figure. That really sort of paprika, that soft clay, like something between a Georgia clay and a paprika, that was used for both the upper side, the velvet part of her shawl, but also most of the sea monsters' heads. Oh no, the sea monsters were the blue color. The paprika was the spines on the sea monsters. They're whatever you call those bristly comb things on them. It's hard to say since I'm not sure that a sea monster has anatomy that we have language for. But anyway, and then the third was the teal that was the sea monster's skin. So those were the three colors that I think were super rich colors that I tried to recreate. And isn't it sort of funny, pendulum swings and things always do come back into fashion. When you think about it, those three colors that I just named, which are essentially, not counting the yellows, these colors, those are very 80s colors. I mean, I remember these kinds of colors like the paprika color and then the off blues being used in our house in the 80s. And they were also popular during the Tudor period, apparently. So I tried to work on some formulas to get those three colors. I was doing it with chemical dyes. She was doing it, of course, with pigments. But this is what I came up with. I came up with some colors that I think were really, really close. These are the three things I ended up with. And I'm going to show you how I got them. So this is that paprika color that's like the comb on the sea monster. This is the turquoise that was over her shoulder. And this lighter teal is like the skin of the creature. These are almost exact to the pictures that I was looking at from the video. And this is how I did it in the end. I fooled around a lot with ratios, with 1/13, with 1/64. But at the end of the day, I got this paprika color with this is the formula. I used Prochem terracotta mixed with Cushing terracotta. No, I take it back. I tried both of those, and I'll show you both of those. They came out completely different. This is Prochem terracotta on its own. This is Cushing terracotta. It's equal amounts of these in the water. I know probably my color is always a bit weird for videos, but Prochem, Cushing. The Cushing terracotta, same name, is a lot more pink and coral than the Prochem. So these were just these two coming out of the gate. The paprika one is the finished one here. So that one was done with Prochem 1/32. This is the unit one. So it's half and half. It was a half and half split. So you can do 30 seconds or 64, so depending how much wool you're putting in. But it was half the color Brick by Prochem and half the color Tangelo by Dharma, Dharma. A 50-50 mix gave me this. The color's weird. Let me see if I can. It gave me this. It's a bit darker than it's looking on camera, but it gave me this, I think, perfect paprika, at least perfect for the Thorny dress. Again, that was Brick, which is a Prochem color, and Tangelo, which is a Dharma color. Now, this color here, the turquoisey color that went over, this one's a bit mottled, it went over her shawl, it was the outer, the lining part, the silk part. That really bright color turned out to be, I did a lot of combos to get that, but in the end, it was 1 part teal, which is jacquard, the jacquard dyes, Jacquard, plus the Cushing color, bronze green, equal parts again. So half bronze green and half teal jacquard. I rarely use jacquard, but in this case, this had the closest sort of value to the color I was looking for. The third one, the teal color, that turned out to be best when it was, you're going to kill me. That was the one that was teal. I'm so sorry. That was the one that was teal and bronze green. Teal and bronze green, equal parts. I am so sorry. The turquoise one was more tricky. I'm so sorry. The turquoise one was peacock, but it was the Dharma peacock, not the Cushing peacock. It was a 3-part split, even. 1 part peacock, Dharma, 1 part mermaid's dream, Dharma, and 1 part indigo, Cushing. Tricky, but 3 equal parts made this. So those are the 3 colors. I fooled like crazy with combinations to get these colors. And what I ended up with, besides these 3 colors, I mixed some other colors because I ended up making, to celebrate this video, if you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it, I celebrated by making a composition that is available on ribboncandyhooking.com now. It's a composition that is kind of a composite of her dress. So this isn't one patch of the thorny dress, but come on, how unusual is it to have an embroidered dress in the Tudor period that is covered with sea monsters? So I used, these are all the exact characters, including the upside down ones, from the thorny dress, but I put them into one composition, and I put the almost Asian looking, some solid, some dotted, and some just like pinprick lines, 3 different styles of lines if you look at the dress again. Fish's tail, and there's 1 bird in it, there's a few flowers in it. This is kind of a lily pad configuration. This little guy seems to have a crown on, unless that's a comb. It's very hard to tell in the picture. But you can refer to her dress too in this video and look up the dress online to get cues for it. But I used, this had a white background color, so if you end up getting this pattern, then you do things with color however you want to do it. If you end up getting this pattern as a kit, then for the background I will give you, it's all going to be door wool, but I'll give you a plain door in the background, plus these 3 colors, plus I wanted to give you a bunch of other colors that were found on her garment. And some of those colors are variations, and some of them I didn't put on this card because this card is basic, but these are all the colors that I came up with for a kit, if you're interested in the kit. They're all very basic colors, and I want to show you some that I added that are really, I think, useful colors. I did variations because I always like to tweak stuff with a little more yellow or a little more green, but I did variations, and I wanted to show you a few colors that come out in an unusual way straight from the packet, unexpected. One of them is bronze green, the Cushing that I just referred to. It's great for Tudor period stuff because it's a great green. This is bronze green, all on its own, not mixed with anything. I thought that was worth showing you because I mixed it with other things. To me, it was more olive than I expected, but I love it as a neutral. Remember that expression, dark, light, dull, bright, that Tamara Pavich always writes in her books? That's very important. This is a great dull. You put something bright next to it like a turquoise and it's really going to sing. You don't have to study the color wheel. You don't have to go to school for art. Dark, light, dull, bright. And this color, bronze green, is really good for that. That's the Cushing color. The other interesting color is this color, which is a Dharma color. This is actually pewter. Now, if you're saying that looks like a rosy brown, it does look like a rosy brown. That's the selvage, of course. But, I mean, it's unexpected. I wouldn't have called this color pewter. It is like a soft, soft brown, but it happens to be, I liked it with this palette, it happens to be another great neutral. So in the course of figuring out how to do these 3 colors, match them to Jessica's pigments, but make them into wool, I learned a lot, and I played a lot with colors that I don't normally touch. I did a series of yellows too, because I thought that was interesting to do yellows. There was, remember in the thorny dress, they did so much with golden stitches. So I thought, you know, if you end up getting this as a kit, you might want to go around the sea monsters with little dots of like a gold color. They used sometimes darker and lighter gold next to each other. But again, this is a fun project and a fun experiment. You don't need to get this as a kit. Obviously, you don't need to get this at all. But if you love this project and you want to celebrate it by doing something to remember it by like this, the sky is the limit. But if you do, refer back to the video or look up the Thorny portrait online, because looking at those color variations is so much fun. I'm very excited to hook this myself and to work in hooking copying a painting of textile, because that's almost like a weird trilogy or triangle, isn't it? It's like the painting is emulating the textile, and I'm doing a textile to emulate the painting, right? Unusual. It's just an unusual project. And I have one other pattern that I put up regarding this show, and this is actually a picture. I'll post the original painting because I don't have it with me. Jessica has it because I gave it to her. I did a painting when I was in college, like the first time, so I must have been like 17 or 18. I was doing a graphic arts thing at the time, but it was at Marymount in Tarrytown, if you remember that. It's not there anymore. But I did this great, I didn't think it was great at the time, but Jessica loves it, painting of beetles. And this is actually it, but it's much bigger. And I found it in the garage, a little bit moldy, and Jessica cleaned it up, being an art restorer, and she's framing it and keeping it because she loves it. For me, I don't have any feelings about it. I'm very happy that she loves it because I'll be happy to see it hanging up in her space in her house. But I included this because this had so much crossover. This is one of the starting points we had talking about the cochineal bugs and the lac bugs, and she says lake bugs, I'm sure she's right. Using all these beetles for pigment. That's one of the things that got us started. So I had to redraw, I call it a colony of beetles because that is, we love collectives on this channel. That is the collective of beetles, is colony. I thought it would be like a grotesque of beetles or something like that, but it's a colony of beetles. So this pattern is also available. These are the two patterns that celebrate this video. And again, thank you to Jessica so much. That was so cool, looking at pigments for fiber, for fine art versus painting for fiber. Apples and oranges, right? But there are some crossovers. And it really, really was fun trying to figure out, I wanted these exact shades, and it really was fun figuring out how to create them and some similar ones that I found in the thorny dress. What a great project to do. This is something you can do at home. Find your favorite painting, it doesn't matter whose it is, and try to create in wool some of the colors that are found in that painting. It's just a fun exercise. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks again to Jess, and I will see you soon from the Ribbon Candy Hooking channel. Have a great day.